Hi everyone, and welcome back to our little Digital Design Lab online series. Today we will be wrapping up Illustrator and do a brief photo editing tutorial in Photoshop. We're going to be discussing a lot of stuff surrounding photos, so hopefully this will help you guys wrap up your postcard projects. We're going to get started in our already pre-made postcard template. As a reminder, your postcards are going to be 4.25 by 6 inches, which means that your document should be 8.5 by 6 inches. So hopping into today's tutorial, we're going to talk real quick about digital hygiene. I talked about this really early on in the series, maybe in the first episode, but you want to make sure that you have a well-organized system to keep track of all your projects. Hopefully you already have a folder created for CalArts and this class. So here I have my folder organized as underscore demo folder. Within it, I have my Illustrator file and a separate folder for all my photos. These photos are all the photos that I'm planning on or already am using in my postcard project. So they're all here and will not get lost somewhere in my downloads or on my desktop. I cannot stress to you how important it is to keep your photos organized. As you advance in CalArts and as a graphic designer, you're going to be working with a lot of projects that have a lot of images. If you lose these images, sometimes you won't be able to find them again within all your series of folders. So make sure that you keep it organized. So the first way to import images is to very simply drag the image file onto your project artboard. This opens the image in your project file. This image is from Unsplash, by the way, which is a good resource for free stock images that are very high quality. The second way you can import images is to take the image and actually drag it into your Adobe Illustrator icon. This will open it up as a new file, so you can actually edit the image without affecting the rest of your project doing it like this. The artboard that it automatically creates will also not follow the image. So going back to our project file, you can see that the image is also much larger than the actual artboard or our project range. So we can very easily just resize the image using our selection tool, the way that we have with all our shapes and all our paths and stuff. You can very easily also, change the proportions of the image by not holding down Shift while resizing images. Obviously, this will distort your image. So I recommend if you're, using the image for like a purposeful reason, resize it holding down Shift. So this feature is rather new to Illustrator, so most of you are probably lucky enough to never have known an Illustrator without it, but the crop tool is really one of the handiest tools in Illustrator. Just honestly imagine doing VisCon without it. So basically, whenever you have your image selected, you will be able to click this crop image thing, change the crop, and hit accept. You won't be able to uncrop the images except by hitting undo, but if you have your original image file in a well-organized place, hint hint, you can always bring it back and recrop it. But the reason why I talk about sort of like the unable to uncrop it, or like adjust it really, is because you can also mask your images. Masking is far less permanent than cropping and can be much more customizable. So let's say we want to make this image the background of our postcard. To mask all the excess of the image, we're going to first use our rectangle tool and create a rectangle the size of one side of our postcard. Selecting both the rectangle and the image, we're going to right-click and select Make Clipping Mask. And because it's a mask, not a crop, you can adjust both the mask itself and the items below. One way to do this is to double-click the mask, which will isolate the layer group. You can tell this worked if a light gray header shows up. Here you can use the selection tool to adjust the size of the mask or use the direct selection tool to move around the image. This is essentially adjusting the crop of the image and allows you to play around with the framing of the image. After selecting the image with the direct selection tool, you can also switch to the regular selection tool to resize the image without resizing the mask. So if I hover over the actual outline of the mask, you'll see that it still has remained the same size and it has not shrunk the way that our image has. So I'm just going to undo a few times and sort of make it look like a background again, and then we'll move on. To exit the isolated layer group, you can double-click outside of the element or click the back arrow by the header. And finally, if you ever actually want to release the clipping mask, you can right-click and hit Release Clipping Mask, which will separate the mask from the image again. For the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to undo that and go back to our mask. Another way you can import images is by going to File and then hitting Place, or Command-Shift-P, which will allow you to select an image from your computer. Go to your Project Images folder and you can choose the image you want to bring in. I'm just going to select this image of a fire hydrant and click Place. So unlike the previous two methods, this method changes your cursor to a thumbnail of the image. If you click and drag, you can place the image at the size and place you want the image to be. Of course, you can always resize it afterwards or crop it or whatever. Now, say we only want the hydrant and we don't want the background of this image. Something we can do is select the pen tool and create an outline of the hydrant. Of course, if this is for something, like for one of your projects, really zoom in there and draw like good paths that really stick to the object. For just this demo, I'm just sort of doing this quick outline of this hydrant, but of course you can do one much better than this. When you finish drawing your outline, just like before, you can select both the outline and the image below, right-click, and create a clipping mask. Now it looks like we've got a floating fire hydrant, which is exactly what we wanted. And of course, you can always resize and adjust the mask the way that we did with the other images before. So next, let's briefly talk about the Layers panel and all that it can do. As usual, if you can't find it, go to the Windows tab and then look for the Layers panel. So unlike Photoshop, layers in Illustrator are not individual elements in your file. They are more like groups of elements and you're in charge of organizing them. So if I open this layer 1, you'll see that all the elements that we have on our page are all sorted into layer 1. Like Photoshop, you can turn off all these eyes to hide layers without deleting them. You can click this little plus sign down here to create a new layer. You may have seen memes about it, but it honestly is really helpful to name all your layers. So for this one, I'm going to name it background, and the one above it, I'm just going to name it elements. So following the layers that we created, I'm just going to take this layer, which is the fire hydrant, and drag it up into the elements layer. Now, if I wanted to just edit my elements and didn't want to edit any of my background, I could just hit this little panel, which locks the layer, and just work on the layer above it. So as you can see, I cannot select the background, it's completely locked. I would say in general, create layers that are smart groups of elements. You don't need to create a new layer for every element since they are already listed separately, so use it as an organization tool. So something else that you can do with layers, I'm just going to create another layer and name this shapes. And I'm just going to create a few random shapes with just a couple varying colors and shapes. So what you can do with the layers panel is you can actually select everything that's within a layer by clicking this little square next to the layer name. This selects everything there, and you can even drag it to another layer and move all of those elements to the other layer. From there, when you have your layer open, you can even select specific shapes that you want, and you can just move those two to another layer. I do find that the color coding system does really help with organizing your layers, so take advantage of that. Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly move those shapes that we move down to the elements layer and move them back to the shapes layer, but that's pretty much it for the layer panel. So going back to talking about images, the next thing that we really need to discuss is embedding photos. So what I'm going to do for this real quick, I'm going to unlock my background and I'm going to hide all the elements other than the background just because that's our biggest image right now. And then I'm going to take my direct selection tool and I'm just going to select our image. As a reminder, I'm using the direct selection tool because our image is currently in a mask. If we use the selection tool, it would simply select the mask and not the actual image. So with our image selected, this little embed button should show up in the top menu. If it says unembed, that means it's already embedded, which means you probably copy and pasted the image into your file or used a different method where your file is not actually saved on your computer. But because we properly imported our images from a folder on our computer, we want to make sure that we embed our photos before we bring it to print or send it to another person. Essentially right now, our image is being traced through the file paths in our computer, but once we embed the image actually into our file, it basically becomes glued into the file, and you don't actually need the link anymore because it is directly placed in the file. This will enlarge your file size, but that's a little bit expected. Just make sure you do this, or else when you go to print on a different computer, or if you send your Illustrator file to like a coworker or something, they won't be able to access the image and it'll just be blank. So I'm just going to hit embed and embed this image into this file. Now it says unembed, which gives you the option to unembed it from your file. So something else that you can do in Illustrator with images is the infamous image trace. So I'm going to use my direct selection tool and I'm going to select our fire hydrant over here. And with the image selected, I'm going to go back up near the embed and hit image trace. Out of all the things that I've warned about not to overuse, this is probably the ultimate one. Although it's almost always really obvious when you are using image trace, it's an incredibly powerful tool that converts your images into vectors. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit this image trace button. Because our image is quite large and quite detailed, we get this error message, but for this I'm just going to ignore it. In general, I would warn you against from using really large or detailed images just because the load time is crazy. So you can see that this turned my image black and white and now has a much more thresholded or high contrast look. Because of this, image tracing can be really helpful to turn things like handwriting or icons into vectors. However, it is often inappropriate to vectorize existing logos because the curves and paths are often damaged through the process. But there are a lot of really cool things you can do with image tracing. So we're going to go ahead and go to this little menu, click it, and it'll open up a dialog. So there's a bunch of different things you can do here. You can change the colors as well as how many colors will show up in your tracing. So you can see that the load time is really crazy with this, which is what happens when you use a really detailed photo. But now that we've changed it to colors, when we zoom into the tracing, you can see that they actually made vectorized shapes in specific colors to make it look like an image, but realistically it's just layers of shapes. There really are a lot of things you can do with image tracing. There's a lot of different customizations, and I would really recommend you play around with some of these and see what you can make. So I'm just going to briefly go back to black and white just because I find it easier to work with. But if you wanted to use each of these vectorized layers and customize them, what you would do is hit expand up here, which turns all the different layers into vectors with points and paths, and then right-click to ungroup. Because this image is still within a clipping mask, I'm just going to double-click in order to get into the isolation mode. And from there, I can just grab any vectorized section of this image, and I'm just going to copy and paste this outside of the isolation group. So you can see after I paste it here that now this is basically just like any other shape. You can zoom in, you can adjust all the points, you can do anything that you could do with any other kind of shape. So while Illustrator is quite limited in what it can do in photo editing, we're next going to move to Photoshop to do a brief photo editing demo because Photoshop is definitely the software made to edit photos. So get a drink of water, go to the restroom or whatever, and then open up Photoshop when you're ready, and we'll move on to the next part of this tutorial.